When we think of female suffrage, we initially consider 1918 as a groundbreaking year where British women were finally given the vote. But what's the problem with this? Whilst the vote was a groundbreaking advancement for women's rights, there were still issues. The Representation of the People Act in 1918 only gave women over the age of 30 with property rights the chance to vote. Although this gave 8.5 million women a voice, it only represented 2/3 of British women. So with this in mind, we ask the question, was 1918 the true year of female suffrage? The century since includes many British laws and acts passed which aim to give women more rights. This documentary will investigate some of these and consider whether 100 years on, women are truly equal. Obvious to many women that needs still existed after the vote in 1918 and saw the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the NUWSS, become the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship, the NUSEC. Feminist campaigner Eleanor Rathbone even stated in 1936, "No doubt some of us exaggerated the power of the vote." The 1930s saw women starting to become more involved in party politics, as women were extremely unrepresented in government, with only 38 women being elected into the House of Commons from 1919 to 1945. The Labour Party's women's sections considered the work of women at home and created reforms to help them. They believed women had the right to social welfare, like nursery and maternity care, and supported the ideas of birth control for married women. The Second World War was pivotal for women as it gave them the chance to work like men and highlight their capabilities in contributing to the war effort. By 1943, over 7 million women from the ages of 18 to 50 were working for war workforces in the absence of male workers. Even though women were given some pay, they were expected to work long hours and still had many responsibilities at home. Women's involvement in the war was effective as it started to get the ball rolling for more reforms for female rights. One of the greatest demands at the time was equal pay, an argument supported by the campaign of the Equal Compensation Campaign Committee, the ECCC, which amended the Personal Injuries Act in 1943 by giving women equal compensation in the event they were injured at work. With the rise of second-wave feminism, the 1960s has been described as the most important flowering of the British women's movement since the pre-1914 suffrage campaign. Women's reproductive rights was a dominant issue from the 1960s. The Abortion Act of 1967 made it legal to get an abortion in the first 28 weeks of a woman's pregnancy. However, this had to be agreed by 2 doctors on the basis it was necessary to avoid harm to the mother or due to risk of the baby being handicapped. Over the course of the remaining 20th century, women's reproductive rights were still argued. With numerous attempts to retract the Abortion Act, the Act was reduced from 28 weeks to 24 weeks in 1990 due to support of Margaret Thatcher. Despite much controversy, the Labour government in 1974 offered free contraception on the NHS. In 1968, the Conservative Party appointed Anthony Cripps as chairman in its investigation into the legal discrimination against women, creating the report Fair Share for Fair Sex, which outlined the necessary changes to increase gender equality. The Sex Discrimination Act was later passed in 1975 under the Labour government and aimed to protect men and women from discrimination within employment, training, education and harassment. The Conservative government was able to introduce many positive reforms for women throughout the 70s. The Matrimonial Proceedings and Property Act in 1970 gave women more share in marriage property. The Attachment of Earnings Act in 1973 allowed courts to enforce maintenance payments against fathers, and the Guardianship Act in 1973 gave mothers equal rights over the ownership of their children. Equal pay was finally granted in 1970 with the Equal Pay Act, but didn't come into effect until 1975. The Act made pay equal for men and women doing the same job. It's safe to say that even looking on how far we've come in 100 years, there is still a long way to go. Back in just January of this year, Carrie Gracie, the BBC's China editor, made the news as she resigned because of unlawful pay discrimination. Her resignation came with finding out her male international editor co-workers were earning more than her. So what can be said about the year 1918? A groundbreaking year in giving women the vote, but only if you were over 30 with property rights. With numerous reforms passed in the century since, and the few touched on here, it can definitely be concluded that 1918 was not the true year of female suffrage.